For nearly a quarter century, Lindsey Graham was one of the most talked about figures in Washington and one of the most talked about mysteries. Reporters covering the Senate could rattle off his positions on defense spending, immigration, and judicial nominations without a second thought. What they could never quite explain was why a man who ran for president, chaired 2 major Senate committees, and spent decades in the national spotlight had never once stood at an altar. Graham joked his way through the question for years. It became a punchline, a talking point, a running bit between him and the reporters who covered him. But when he died suddenly in the summer of 2026, the joke fell away, and the real answer, the one his family had understood all along, finally reached the public in his sister's own words. Lindsey Graham was born on July 9, 1955, in central South Carolina, a small town where his parents ran a combination restaurant, bar, pool hall, and liquor store known locally as the Sanitary Cafe. The family didn't just work there. For years, they lived in a single room behind the business itself, according to accounts Graham gave throughout his political career. It was an unglamorous start for a boy who would eventually sit on the Senate Judiciary Committee and run for the White House, but Graham rarely tried to hide it. If anything, he leaned into it, describing his upbringing behind the bar as the thing that shaped nearly everything he became. He was the first person in his family to go to college, enrolling at the University of South Carolina with plans that, at the time, had nothing to do with national politics. Those plans were appended in 1976, when Graham was 21 years old. His mother, Millie, died of Hodgkin's lymphoma. 15 months later, his father, Florence James Graham, died suddenly of a heart attack. In the span of little more than a year, Graham had lost both parents, and he was now the only adult relative left for his younger sister, Darlene, who was still a young teenager, somewhere between 12 and 13 years old, depending on which of the 2 deaths is used as the reference point. There was no trust fund waiting, no extended family structure ready to absorb a grieving adolescent. There was only a college student in his early 20s and a little sister who now had nowhere else to turn. Friends and former aides who spoke with reporters after Graham's death described a young man who essentially had to grow up overnight, trading the ordinary concerns of a college student for the responsibilities most people don't take on until decades later, if ever. One longtime political consultant who worked with Graham for years put it simply: everything about the man could be traced back to his boyhood, to the years spent behind that bar, and to the way he handled the responsibility of raising his sister once their parents were gone. That responsibility didn't arrive with any instructions. Graham had to figure out, essentially on his own, how to be both an older brother and something closer to a parent to a child who had just watched both of her parents die within little more than a year of each other. He was still an undergraduate himself, working toward a degree, with no real financial cushion and no roadmap for what came next. It would have been easy and understandable for him to have looked for another arrangement, a relative willing to take Darlene in, a guardian better equipped for the job. He didn't take that route. Rather than send Darlene to live with relatives, Graham made the choice to keep her with him and raise her himself. After he enrolled in the Air Force Judge Advocate General's Corps and began active duty in the early 1980s, he formally adopted his own sister so she would be covered under his military health and family benefits, a detail NPR and other outlets confirmed in coverage following his death. It wasn't a symbolic gesture. It meant real, unglamorous responsibility. School troubles, everyday logistics, the slow work of raising a kid through grief, layered on top of law school and, later, a demanding legal career in uniform. For part of that stretch, Graham was stationed overseas with the Air Force, which meant managing his sister's upbringing from a distance for periods of time, leaning on family friends in Central to help fill the gaps. It was an unusual arrangement for a man in his 20s, and it left very little space in his life for the kind of dating and courtship most people his age were doing. Darlene has said plainly, in interviews going back years before her brother's death, that this was the reason he never married. Speaking to the New York Times in 2015, during Graham's short-lived run for the Republican presidential nomination, she described him as a young man who took on the job of raising a girl and then a teenager while he was still finishing his own schooling, and who simply devoted himself to that responsibility. It wasn't framed as a sacrifice he resented. By her account, it was closer to a promise he made and never broke. Graham himself touched on this in his own memoir, acknowledging that he came close to marrying once, early in his adult life, while he was juggling his sister's upbringing with his military career. He wrote that the right timing never quite arrived, that he never found the moment, or the relationship never lined up with everything else he was carrying. According to later reporting, that near miss involved a woman he dated while stationed in Europe with the Air Force in the 1980s, a relationship he considered but ultimately didn't pursue toward marriage. With his sister largely grown and his active duty service behind him, Graham moved into elected politics. He worked as an assistant attorney for Oconee County, then as city attorney for his own hometown of Central, before winning a seat in the South Carolina House of Representatives in 1992. 2 years later, he won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. In 2002, he moved to the Senate, succeeding the long-serving Strom Thurmond, and went on to win re-election multiple times over the following 2 decades, including a 5th-term campaign he was actively running at the time of his death, with backing from South Carolina Republicans like Senator Tim Scott and Governor McMaster. Throughout that career, he remained a member of the Air Force Reserve, ultimately logging more than 3 decades of total military service, including years as a prosecutor and defense attorney, before retiring from the reserve in 2015. Few senators carried that kind of dual identity, lawmaker and JAG officer, for as long as Graham did, and colleagues often pointed to it as part of what made his voice on defense and national security matters carry extra weight. It also meant that, for years, Graham was living 2 demanding professional lives at once, on top of the personal responsibility he'd taken on for his sister, a schedule that left even less room for the kind of settled home life most of his Senate colleagues eventually built for themselves. That combination of small-town roots, military discipline, and personal loss shaped Graham's reputation as a workhorse rather than a show horse for much of his early career, even as he later became one of the most recognizable faces in Republican politics. Colleagues who served alongside him for decades often noted that he rarely took real vacations and treated the Senate itself as something close to a second family, a description that, in hindsight, lines up closely with the story his sister eventually told about why he never built a family of his own in the more traditional sense. In Washington, Graham became known for his close friendship with the late Senator John McCain of Arizona. Along with Senator Joe Lieberman, the two were sometimes called the Three Amigos for their bipartisan work on foreign policy and defense issues. McCain used to joke that he'd watched Graham date plenty of women over the years without ever getting seriously close to marriage, a line delivered with real affection, and one that became something of a standing joke between the 2 men whenever reporters brought up the subject. That friendship endured through McCain's 2017 brain cancer diagnosis and his death in 2018. In the years after, Graham stayed close to the McCain family. Meghan McCain, John McCain's daughter, later wrote a personal tribute describing Graham as someone she and her family had essentially adopted as an extension of their own household, recalling that he kept visiting and calling for years after the cameras and political obligations faded. Graham's legislative record reflected the same willingness to work across the aisle that defined his bond with McCain. He partnered with the late Senator Ted Kennedy in the mid-2000s on comprehensive immigration reform, an effort aimed at strengthening border security while also creating a pathway to legal status for undocumented immigrants already in the country. It drew fire from conservative activists who saw any legal pathway as amnesty, but Graham held that effective policy required balancing enforcement with a workable system, and he returned to the issue again in 2013 as part of the Senate's bipartisan Gang of 8, which produced legislation that passed the Senate but stalled in the House. On foreign policy, Graham built a reputation as one of the Senate's most consistent hawks, someone who argued that American leadership abroad was essential to global stability. He traveled overseas repeatedly to see conflicts firsthand rather than rely solely on briefings back in Washington, visiting troops and diplomats during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. In later years, after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he became one of Congress's most visible advocates for continued American support for Kyiv, making numerous trips to meet with Ukrainian officials, including President Volodymyr Zelensky, and arguing that backing Ukraine was a matter of strategic interest, not simply goodwill. His political identity shifted dramatically over the course of his career. During the 2016 Republican primary, Graham was one of Donald Trump's sharpest critics within the party, at one point calling him a bigot over his proposal to ban Muslims from entering the country, a comment that led Trump to publicly share Graham's personal cell phone number at a campaign rally. But in the years following McCain's death, Graham became one of Trump's closest allies in the Senate, chairing the Senate Judiciary Committee from 2019 to 2021 and later the Senate Budget Committee, a role he held until his own death. It was during his brief 2016 presidential campaign that Graham's unmarried status became a genuine talking point rather than a Washington in-joke. Reporters repeatedly asked who would serve as First Lady if he somehow reached the White House. Rather than get defensive, Graham leaned into the humor, telling one interviewer he had a sister and plenty of friends who could rotate through the role if it ever came to that. The night before he formally announced his candidacy, Graham and Darlene stopped together at their parents' graves in Central, the same small town where they'd grown up in the rooms behind the family bar. By some accounts, Darlene walked into the old pool room above their childhood home for the first time in roughly 3 decades that night, a moment that left her visibly emotional as she confronted memories of the parents she'd lost as a child. It was a quiet ritual that said more about Graham's priorities than any of the jokes he told on stage the next day. Darlene played a genuine supporting role throughout that campaign, appearing at events and sitting for interviews meant to help voters understand her brother's background. It was during one of those interviews with the New York Times that she gave what would become the clearest public explanation of why her brother had never married, language she would repeat, in different forms, for years afterward and again after his death. Lindsey Graham died on the evening of July 11, 2026, at the age of 71, following what his office initially described as a brief and sudden illness. A preliminary finding from the medical examiner of the District of Columbia later attributed his death to an aortic dissection connected to hardened arteries, a condition that can develop silently for years before turning fatal without warning. He had returned from a trip to Ukraine, where he'd met with President Zelensky, only hours before he died, and he had a high-profile television appearance scheduled for the very next morning. Tributes arrived from across the political spectrum within hours, from President Trump to Senate colleagues in both parties to foreign leaders who had come to know Graham through his frequent overseas travel. But amid the flood of official statements, it was Darlene Graham Dunn who offered the most personal account of who her brother really was. Now a mother of 2 who has spent her career helping people with disabilities find employment, Darlene described her brother's decision to raise her as something he treated as more important than building a family of his own. Speaking to NPR after his death, she recalled that in the hardest days after they lost their parents, Lindsey told her he was going to take care of her and be there for her, and in her words, that's simply who he was. He kept that promise, she said, for the rest of his life. Graham's official obituary echoed the same through line his sister had described for years, a young man in his early 20s, suddenly responsible for a grieving teenager, who built his entire adult life around a promise made in the aftermath of tragedy. That story traced a straight line from the rooms behind the sanitary cafe through law school, through decades of military service, and into the United States Senate. Darlene herself had largely stayed out of the political spotlight for most of her adult life. She built a career working with the South Carolina Commission for the Blind and later in workforce development, helping people with disabilities find employment, work that had nothing to do with Capitol Hill and that she kept up even while occasionally stepping into the public eye to support her brother's campaigns. She married Larry Dunn, and the two raised 2 daughters together in South Carolina, a quieter and more private version of the family life her brother never pursued for himself. Photos she shared publicly over the years showed a woman who valued that privacy, appearing at her brother's side during major campaign moments and then largely disappearing from view again once the cameras moved on. In a fitting final chapter, South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster appointed Darlene to serve out the remainder of her brother's Senate term, making her the first woman to represent South Carolina in the U.S. Senate. She took the oath of office under her legal name, Darlene Graham, telling reporters that her brother had always been there for her and that she intended to return the favor. President Trump publicly credited himself with recommending her for the role, calling her selection a fitting tribute to a brother who, in his words, loved her dearly. In the weeks that followed her appointment, Darlene also made clear she wouldn't simply be a continuation of her brother's political brand. Speaking with Fox News, she said that while she shared the values she and Lindsey were raised with, hard work, faith, and remembering where you came from, she had her own way of approaching the job, and planned to focus more on everyday domestic concerns than on the foreign policy debates that had defined so much of her brother's career. It was, in its own quiet way, One more example of a sibling stepping into a role she never expected to hold, shaped by a brother who had done the same thing for her exactly 50 years earlier. What Darlene's account ultimately reveals isn't a hidden scandal or a secret relationship kept from public view. It's something plainer, and in its own way more affecting. Lindsey Graham never married because, in the most literal sense, he had already built a family decades earlier, when a 21-year-old college student chose to raise his little sister rather than let her be scattered among distant relatives. Every joke about a rotating first lady, every deflection in a campaign interview, sat quietly on top of that original decision. It took his sister, speaking in the days after his death and in the years before it, to spell out in full what so many people in Washington had only ever guessed at from a distance.